Hello and welcome to episode 9 of Bicep for Real. So, this week we're going to pick up from where we left off last week and we're going to look at two things. First up, we're just going to briefly look at fixing the issue we saw last week. So, if you remember, we had some issues with our pipeline and the way that container registries were being created. So, we're just going to quickly fix that up and get that pipeline working end to end. And then we're going to then take a look at taking that pipeline to the next stage and introducing environments. So the minute we can deploy to the development environment, we want to roll this out to test and to production, and we want to use a pipeline and using environments and stages for that. And so we're going to have a look at how we can do that. So we're still working on our Landed Toys digital store project. We've got all our infrastructure written in infrastructure as code now, and that's deploying and working well in our dev environment. And then if you remember from our requirements document, in particular, we're going to need here to deploy 3 different environments: dev, test, and prod. We're doing dev all right at the moment. We want to do test and prod. We don't want to have to rewrite all that code. It's a complete waste of time. The environments are going to look the same or very similar. So we want to reuse that code and be able to push through different environments as we do the deployment. So let's have a look at how we can do that. Okay, so first up, we need to fix the issue that we encountered last week. And I've actually fixed this and got this working, so I'm just going to show you what I did rather than making you watch me write that out. So if you remember, the issue was the fact that we were trying to deploy our end-to-end process using the pipeline. And before we did that, we'd done it in stages, and we'd done bits and pieces and come back to it and so on. And one of the things we were doing was we were deploying the container registry as part of our core deployment, and then passing the details of that onto our Azure Container App deployment to use that container registry. But we had a problem in that that registry doesn't actually have any images in it. The images are being built and pushed by our development team, and that happens outside of our infrastructure deployment process. It worked previously because we did all our core work in one episode, got the developers to push the image through in and outside of that, and then came back and did the ACA piece, and the images were there. But that's not going to work going forward. So we had to really think, okay, and we moved the container registry out of the infrastructure as code we're doing here. And if we quickly have a look over in the Azure portal, what we've got is we've created another resource group and we've deployed a couple of container registries into that resource group, a dev one and a prod one, and we'll see why we're doing that later. And we've created that separately and outside of our infrastructure code. So these will live on even when we destroy the environments and create them and so on. Now you could create these using your own separate infrastructure as code file and you run that on its lifecycle, even have a pipeline for managing your registries. That's absolutely fine. But it's separate to the pipeline that we're going to use to deploy our actual application. So back in our actual Bicep templates, we've had to make a few changes. So firstly, in our core section, we've just removed the code that was creating the actual container registry and the outputs and so on. So got rid of those. Then in our ACA template, we didn't actually need to do anything because we already had some parameters that took the name of the registry and the credentials and so on. So that's already there. So all we've done is we have added in some parameters to our main template to accept those details coming from outside. So the registry name, the registry username, and the password as a secure string. And then if we go look at our parameters file, we've added in 3 new values: the actual name of the registry, the username of the registry, and then the credentials, which we've stored in a key vault. The same key vault we're using for the certificate, again, lives outside of our deployment. This is all kind of prerequisite stuff that we need to get created before we do a deployment, and we're referencing that directly. And then once we then run the deployment, it all runs through and we get our green ticks there. So that deployment all works fine and it's pulling that image in from that outside registry. So that's all fixed up. If you want to have a look more at the code, look in the Git repository. That's all set up, ready to use that approach. And yeah, that's good to go. This is our pipeline at the moment. As you can see, it's got a single job and it runs that. And that's pretty much it. Now, what we want to do is actually be able to have our deployments go through different environments. So deploy to development, maybe we do some testing or something in development, then we move it to the test environment, and then we move it into the production environment. And we want to do that in a way that we're reusing our infrastructure as code. So we're deploying the same thing in those environments. We might vary things slightly. We might change the name. Maybe we might change some sizes or some information about the resources. But the actual code we're going to use is the same. So we don't want to duplicate that code because that's a waste of time. So instead, what we're going to do is we're going to use our existing code and start deploying in stages. And there's two steps for this. One of which is just on the infrastructure as code side, on the Bicep side, and you could do this without pipelines. And then the second part is actually where we introduce stages into our pipeline to make our automated deployment process easier. So if we hop back to VS Code, and the key thing we need to sort out is our parameters file. And that's what allows us to vary what we do between the environments. So the key factor here is when you're writing your templates, you need to make sure that anything you need to vary is configured as a parameter. And in our case, because of the way we're doing this nesting and so on, it needs to be a parameter in the main template. So all these parameters we've got here allow us to vary what goes into our actual deployment. Anything that's hard coded or maybe it's in a variable rather than a parameter or anything like that is not going to be something we can change at deploy time. So that's going to affect all of the environments. If you wanted to have a different setup for a different environment with that sort of thing, you basically have to duplicate the code, and we don't want to do that. So parameterize everything you want to change. That then means when we want to go from the dev environment to the test environment, the only changes we need to make actually to our configuration rather than to our actual code. So what we're going to do is we've got our dev configuration file here. Let's just copy that and paste it, and then we'll rename it to test.json. This is going to be our test environment. Okay, so let's see what we want to do here. So there's a couple of things. We're going to vary a few things. So first of all, we're going to deploy our test environment to North Europe, just to test out different regions. Now we've got our naming convention here, our prefix, and so it doesn't want to be dev. This wants to be test. Okay, and then we're going to keep the same version because we want to push that through the different environments. The key vault that we're going to use for our certificate is the same. The container registry name is the same, and all those details are the same. So we'll leave that as is. And then we're going to do that again. We're going to copy and paste it, and we're going to create our prod environment as well. So that's going to go back into West Europe. We're going to change the prefix to prod. Now we have got a separate production container registry. Remember we looked at the portal earlier. We've actually got a separate registry, and that's quite a common approach. You don't necessarily want to have your production environment using a dev test registry because there could be things in there you don't actually want to get to production. So we're going to change that to use our prod registry, and the same thing down here. We're using the same key vault to actually get the secret, but the name of the secret has been changed to lambda ACR prod rather than dev. So you can see now we've got 3 different environments set up here that are ready to go that have different settings depending on what the environment is. And you can vary those settings however you want, so long as you parameterized those options in your template. So that's us set up on the Bicep side. Now we need to do some work in terms of the pipeline. If you were going to manually deploy this, so you weren't using pipelines, then you could absolutely do this now just by specifying the different config file at the azcli command when you run that to pick the right environment. But we're going to go and now automate that through our pipeline. So if you remember our pipeline here, we've got one step and one job as an implied job here to actually deploy that to our dev environment. Well, we will need to change this up to use what are called stages within Azure DevOps. So stages allow you to have different environments, stages, and so on that happen that deploy similar things. Okay, so let's go and set that up. And so we've got a few things we do. So first thing we're going to do is we're just going to set it up so that we've got our development stage first. So just taking what we already do and turn that into a stage. So the keyword we hear is stages. And then under the stages, you can have multiple sections, you can have multiple stages. So we're going to have a stage called development. And there are various things you can set at the stage level. So you can set there's display name, so we'll do that. Just call that Now, the display name, you can have spaces and other things, and you can't have that in the actual stage name. Let's also spell display correctly. You can have a pool setting, so you can do this to set which deployment pool you want. We're not going to do that because we've got this pool set up here, and that applies to all of the stages. So if you just want to use the same one, you don't need to set it at the actual stage level. We're not going to need that. And one thing you are going to need, though, is variables. If there are any variables from the Azure DevOps side you want to feed in, then you want to, and they need to be set at the stage level, then you do that here. And you can see here from before, remember, we've got these variables, but you notice they're going to vary per stage. This is the dev resource group name and the location. So let's move those down into our variables section and get rid of that. And then the next thing we need is to set the jobs. Now, we didn't have jobs in the previous one because there was only one of them, so I kind of created an implied job. But a job is a set of steps. So we're going to create the job, and then within the job, we are going to have our steps. So we need a job, and then within the job is where our steps go. So you do get quite a lot of nesting here. And for a single job, this is kind of a little bit superfluous. But if we wanted to have multiple jobs, which we might in the future, then we will, we'll want to actually to use those. So within our job, we've then got our steps. And then within that, we've got the actual tasks that we're going to run. So, the actual deployment. Okay. So that will do development. So let's go and create a second stage, which is going to be our test environment. So we've created that. We'll change this to test. Take that to that. So our resource group name, we're going to change to test. If you remember from the other settings we used North Europe. Okay, then the rest of it is pretty similar, except for the fact that we need to change our parameters file. I'm going to call that test.json. Now we could pull that out into a variable. In fact, let's do that so it's clear. So we're just going to call this config file name, and that's going to be test.json. So we'll take that down here. Do that the same. And we'll do the same thing for our development as well. So we're consistent. It's going to be dev.json. And so we'll use the variable syntax to put that in there. Okay. Now, the last thing we might want to do here is add a dependency. So at the minute, this will probably it will probably work. It'll probably run in the order we've added them, but it's good to define explicit dependencies to make sure that one stage has to finish before the next. So what we can do here is we can just add a depends syntax, right? Depends on section. And this, then you can give it the name of the stage you want it to add on. So we'll do development. That'll take a single string, or if you want it to depend on multiple stages, you can add an array as well. So that should be ready to go. We'll come back and we'll do prod in a minute, but let's just make sure this works for what we've got here in terms of adding those stages, because it will look a bit different then as well. So we're going to commit that. I'm going to push that up to the repository. Message, we're adding stages, and sync that, and then we'll go have a look over in the Azure DevOps portal to see what's what. And you'll be shocked to learn that that failed. We got an error here about a mapping not expected. This was down to my code. So if we go back to VS Code, the issue is that jobs is obviously that you can have multiple jobs. So I needed to turn job into an array, adding the hyphen there to do that. Commit that back through, and then that then kicked off a deployment. And you can see now we've got two stages. So it's going to do the development environment, and then it's got the test environment to happen after that. So you can see that's working. The deployment should work, but that will then do those one after another. So if we go back over to here, so we want to create our production environment now. So let's take a copy of test. We'll just add that onto the end. We'll rename it. So we'll just call that production environment. We want to make sure that depends on the test environment. We're going to call the resource group dash prod. I'm going to put that back into West Europe, and the file name is the config file name is prod.json. Okay, that should be all we need. And so that will deploy prod as well. However, we want to do something a little bit extra with prod. We don't just want deployments to automatically go into production once they've gone through the test stage and that's succeeded. We want to add a manual approval gate so that somebody has to come along and say, yes, this can go into production. You don't have to do this. If you want your deployments to flow all the way through, that's fine. But we want to do that for our production environment. Now, this isn't quite as seamless or easy to do in Azure DevOps as you might think, and you need to do it through the actual UI rather than through YAML at the moment. All we need is an environment. So if you see over here on the left, you've got this environment section. And an environment is basically a set of resources and instructions and so on that apply to a particular job or deployment. So you'll see a bit more when I create. So let's create a new environment. We're going to call it Lambda Employees Production. And we're going to leave the resources as none. You can use environments to define things like which Kubernetes cluster you're going to deploy to or VMs. We're not going to use them for that, but you can. So if you create that, and in here, you've got the environment. And say the assumption is you're going to add resources, and that's not what we're going to do. And that's not what a lot of people do. You can be kind of misusing environments a little bit, but it still works the job. So if you go up here on the right, and you've got this approvals and checks section. And so this allows us to add checks to our deployment before they actually run. So things like approvals, which we're going to do, branch controls, so that you only allow deployments to development from productions from certain branches, for example, or business hours. There's a whole load of different things. You can even have custom validations using functions and those sort of things. So we're going to come in here. We're going to add an approval section, and then you can add the users that can approve this. So I'm going to add myself. This one. And that's that. That's an approval stage now ready for our production environment. But the production environment is not actually going to use it yet. So let's just copy the name over here. Go back to Azure DevOps. Go back to the Visual Studio Code. And approvals are done in the job section. So in here, we want to add, I believe it's, let me just check the syntax, but I think it's just environment. Yep. Environment, and because we've got spaces in it, we'll put quotes, and that should now put the production environment into that environment. Again, we're overloading the word environment, which is not necessarily helpful, but that's set and is ready to use that. And so we should find when we do our deployment that it's ready. When it gets to production, it asks for an approval. So let's just commit that back in. Let that run through the deployment, and we'll see what happens when we get to the production stage. So again, we had a couple of failures. The first thing we need to fix is the actual job. So before we put this in, we had just the stage under here. Actually, when you move to using an environment, you have to add this extra deployment section in. And under that, then you have to add some more detail around the deployment strategy. So you can do different types of deployment strategies here. We're just using the normal one, which is run once. But there are other things you can do in the strategy piece. So under that, you then nest the steps and the tasks. You only need to do this if you're using the environment piece. So for our first two stages, we're not going to switch that. We could switch it to use deployment to be consistent as well, and not add an environment. That would also work, but we'll just keep this simple. So we had to add that in. Secondly, I had to switch up the test environment to use West Europe. For some reason, I was getting an error in North Europe about availability of resources for Cosmos DB. So there seems to be some sort of resource problem in North Europe at the moment for some reason. So I switched that to West Europe just to make that work. Once we got that going, the deployment then ran through. And if we go have a look back at Azure DevOps, and so you can see in DevOps, we've run through our development and test environments. They've all worked fine. We've got to our production stage. This is firstly asking for permission. Now, this is different to actually the approval. This is asking to be allowed to use the environment. This is a one-off, so we'll go ahead and permit that. That should then, yep. Oh, let's go back. Yep, so you can see that it's now waiting for a check to pass. So it needs an approval. The one approval needs your review before you can continue the production environment. And you can see here. So you can click on review here, or you can click on this check as well, this box as well, and it will take you to the page and it still say, ask you to approve or reject the deployment. And you can give a reason. And it will then go ahead if you approve it. So let's approve that. And that will now start the production deployment and run that through. And once that's done, they will all be green and that will be deployed. So that'll do for this week. You've seen we've sorted out our ACR problem and we've gone through now and we've created multiple different environments for our deployment. So now not only do we have our dev environment, we can deploy in dev and move through to test and production and so on. Next week, we're going to take that a bit further and we're going to look at how we do our process in terms of how do we make sure that we are promoting appropriately between environments. We'll look at testing and those sort of things to make our process a lot more foolproof. We'll also look at why that's just failed. I'm not sure what's up with the production environment. I'll have a look at that in a minute, but we will have a look at that next time as well. So hopefully that was useful and you can take that away and apply that to your resources, and I'll see you next time.